Hello. Today we'll be looking at Social Studies Civics and Government Standard number 10 for the state of Georgia. Demonstrate knowledge of the executive branch of government. Specifically today we'll be looking at letter D of that standard, which looks at analyzing the role of the Electoral College in electing the president and the clarification provided in the 12th Amendment. The Electoral College, as seen through an example here from the 2016 presidential election, is a system that was designed by the framers of the Constitution in order to keep a concentration of political power from falling into the hands of one party or one group of politicians. The Electoral College simply is a system where each state's electoral votes are awarded to one sole winner, whoever wins the popular vote in that state. Now, there are a couple of states, Nebraska, for example, and Maine, that divide their electoral votes based on proportion, but for the majority of all states, the electoral votes in those states are winner take all. So whoever wins the popular vote in that state, for example, like Georgia in 2016, wins all 16 of Georgia's electoral votes. As evidenced in the 2016 presidential election, the Electoral College is not void of controversy. As we will see in this mini lesson throughout the history of the United States, the presidential election has often been rampant with controversy due to the outcome of the Electoral College. Controversy in presidential elections does not always stem from the Electoral College, but it is often a factor. As you can see here, this mini lesson is going to focus on 4 different examples of controversial presidential elections. The first that we'll focus on is the election of 1824. The very first moment of controversy within our presidential election system came in 1824 in this wide open race. As you can see here, the 1824 election featured 4 different candidates. You had John Quincy Adams, you had Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. What makes this an interesting race was that basically all 4 candidates were in a dead heat. This is not necessarily a primary situation, so all 4 candidates stayed in the race up until the general election day. As you can see here from the tally at the bottom, the electoral vote breaks down very tightly. Andrew Jackson won 99 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams close behind at 84. William Crawford, Henry Clay trailed farther behind than that. Also, you can see Jackson won the popular vote by a pretty wide margin, winning 41% of that vote. The only problem is, according to the Constitution, the presidential election winner must win a majority. That means 50% plus one more vote of the electoral votes in order to become president. So Jackson, even though he won a plurality, he won the most votes, he did not win a majority. Therefore, the election goes to the House of Representatives. That's where the controversy springs here in 1824. The corrupt bargain, as it was coined by Andrew Jackson, saw Henry Clay, the failed presidential candidate who was also the Speaker of the House, cut a backroom deal with John Quincy Adams. Adams would be voted president in the House of Representatives with Clay's influence as Speaker, and Adams would make Clay his Secretary of State, making half the country livid as the presidential candidate in Jackson that they had voted a plurality was denied the White House. Jackson would win in 1828 in a landslide and serve 2 terms as one of the most popular presidents in our history. 1860. a presidential election most are probably very familiar with, as Abraham Lincoln, one of our most notable presidents, would see his presidential term start here with victory. To set the stage for 1860, you would have to know what was going on within the entire country as the North and South threatened to become divided in two different nations. Therefore, we see four different candidates. For decades, the issue of slavery and how to deal with it going forward in the United States threatened to tear the country apart. The South, an agricultural economy very dependent on slavery and slave labor, was staunch in defending the institution of slavery and its existence. Northern abolitionists and the North in general wished to see the Southern states fall in line with the rest of the country and abolish the institution of slavery. Many in the North who were not pro-slavery were pro-union, meaning they wished to see the Union stay together over all else. Therefore, if slavery must exist for the United States to stay whole, then they would have slavery exist instead of be abolished. This sprung up many different opinions and perspectives, and so the 1860 election saw four different candidates. Lincoln, the Northern Republican; Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat running on the principles of most Southerners and most pro-slavery Southerners; John Bell, a Union Party candidate from Tennessee; and Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democratic Party's candidate. A heated election saw Lincoln win a majority of electoral votes with 180 and become president in 1861. The 1860 election was a representative of the entire nation and the different emotions and heated opinions of slavery and the Union of the United States. Lincoln's election saw the South reach its breaking point, as just a couple of months after the election, the first Southern states, beginning with South Carolina, decided to secede from the United States and form its own country, the Confederacy. Southerners saw Lincoln's election as the straw that broke the camel's back. Lincoln did not win a single Southern state. Southern Democrat Breckinridge won the entire South, but did not even come close to winning enough electoral votes to become president. Southerners did not see themselves represented in Lincoln or in the Northern Republican Party, and therefore they decided to form a nation that they saw fit to represent them. The 1860 election is by far the most divisive in our nation's history, and the outcome would lead to an almost 5-year civil war that was the bloodiest conflict in the history of the United States. Nowhere near as heated as the 1860 or 1824 elections throughout its history, the presidential election of 2000 definitely saw the most controversial outcome of any presidential election in history. Coming off the heels of 2 terms from Democratic President Bill Clinton, his Vice President Al Gore sought to continue Clinton's policies in running for the presidency in the year 2000. His opponent, Republican George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, sought to bring the Republicans back into the Oval Office. A very tight race came down to the very end. On election night, many different news media outlets claimed that George W. Bush was the winner. However, Al Gore and his campaign identified Florida as the place where they would make their stand and dispute the outcome. Florida, being a traditionally very close state in terms of presidential elections, was just as normal down to the wire between the Republican and Democratic candidates. Bush had been declared winner of Florida, and with that, gained the electoral votes to put him over the top of the number 270, to put him at 271, and give him a majority of electoral votes and make him the president-elect. However, Gore's campaign claimed that many of the large counties in Florida needed to be recounted. Either they were too close to call, or unsatisfactory voting conditions had led to some votes that did not need to be counted and should be thrown out. Therefore, a month-long standoff began over the entire month of November and into December of the year 2000 for what would be done to decide the presidential election. In the media, every single day, 24/7, non-stop coverage of what would be the outcome of the 2000 presidential election engulfed the entire nation. Finally, in early December, the election went before the United States Supreme Court in the landmark case Bush v. Gore to decide the winner of the 2000 presidential election. Gore and his campaign were looking for the Supreme Court to rule in their favor and give them the authority that they needed to continue recounts in order to try to catch George W. Bush's number in Florida. However, the Bush campaign sought to get a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court that would stop the recounts and declare him the winner, basically running out the clock, as Bush was ahead of Gore with the popular vote in Florida. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court handed down a 5-4 decision in favor of George W. Bush, claiming that the recount must be stopped and the election must be over in a timely manner so that the president-elect could make plans to take office when inaugurated a month later in January. The 2000 presidential election is the foremost prime example of proponents of the popular vote being the determinant in presidential elections, as George W. Bush won the electoral vote with 271 to Gore's 266, even after Bush v. Gore. However, as you can see here, the popular vote was won by Gore by over 500,000 votes. 2016 would see a similar outcome in Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton in terms of the popular vote winner not winning the electoral vote.